will be made well." Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. At once, Jesus realized in himself that the power had gone out of him, and he turned around to the crowd and he said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see this large crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and with trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." And while he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" And when Jesus overheard what was said, he said to the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, only believe." So I'm going to pray again for our time. God, just thank you for the gift of your word, through the gift of story of how you in flesh as Jesus walks among us. God, and thank you for the gift of being able to look back on a completed story and see how you work and you move and you heal. And God, for our stories, which are not yet complete, ones we are living in real time that we are not looking back on, I just ask for this story, this miracle, to be encouraging to us all. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So before digging into the story, I feel like it's important to give a little recap of where we've been the past couple of weeks. So if you were here 2 weeks ago, you heard Monica teaching about the woman at the well. And there was a theme on identity where a Samaritan woman was known by Jesus, and Jesus shared his own identity with her. And there was this mutual exchange of life that happened. And so just to give a quick recap of what she taught, Jesus chose to journey through Samaria, which he did not have to do. Jews historically did not venture in that area, so he made this decision as the Spirit led him to meet with a woman who had suffered great loss. And Monica shared with us that this popular part of the story of where Jesus interacts with her and says, "You're right, you don't have a husband, you've had 5, likely means that she'd suffer loss either through death of them or rejection by them, as women at that time could not divorce on their own. So it's likely that she is at this well, rejected, marginalized by all who've interacted with her, and Jesus knew that. And then she encountered him, and the way she describes Jesus is he is a man who's told her everything that she has ever done, and that Jesus is the one that she has been waiting for. And then the kind of summary statement that comes out of that is Jesus pursues the rejected and marginalized and lonely, speaks to the depth of their pain, and then in that story invited her into a relationship with him, sending her to proclaim the gospel in Samaria, a place which, again, Jews did not go and did not hang out in, and a place where the gospel had not yet been. And then last week we had a Vision Sunday with Daisy and with Chad leading us through communion and teaching. And we talked about this idea of taking aim, of Jesus at the center of our target and being the one that we are aiming towards. We aren't haphazardly moving as a church, but we have Jesus at our center, and our heart is to aim towards him. And then we talked about that Jesus inspires Harbor, both collectively and us as individuals, to walk in our world as he does. And then one concept that's been coming up time and time again is this idea of eccentric circles. So that target is what the picture Daisy gave us, but with Jesus at the center, each circle going outward is affected by what is at the center there. And then we were encouraged to lift Jesus up and to exalt him in our lives. And then Monica said something that was a one-liner that stuck with me, and she just said it's all for naught if we lose sight of who's at the center. So our encouragement as a church is for Jesus to be the center of our target. And last Sunday, I came into the time not exactly sure which direction to go. My thought process goes in a lot of different ways at a lot of different times. It's a bit of a spider web in here. And so I thought that I was going in a different direction, but during the service last week, I really feel like God gave me this story because I started to ask the question, what might a target look like playing out in real life? So what might it look like to aim for Jesus at the center? And what came to my mind is it might look like a crowd gathering around a fixed point. And so the Spirit brought this story to my mind of the bleeding woman and how Jesus was surrounded on all sides, but for whatever reason, she was the one that had an encounter with him that was different. And so I just want to read again the story from Mark 5 and then jump into what God has been teaching me through it. So just to read it again, starting in verse 21, it says, "When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, 'My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, that she will be healed and live.' So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed against him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, 'If I just touch his clothes, then I'll be healed.' Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see the people in the crowd against you,' his disciples answered, 'and yet you asked, who touched me?'" I'm going to pause because the disciples always make me feel a little bit better about myself sometimes. Sometimes I can feel a little like, I actually have faith because I just asked Jesus this question, and then the disciples show up and they do something silly like this, even though they've been walking with him. So be encouraged if you ever have moments like I do where you are questioning God and what he's doing. The disciples who lived side by side with him did the same. So you're not doing anything wrong. You are simply living a human experience with a divine God. I will pick back up in verse 32. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some came from the house of Jairus. The synagogue leader said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" And Jesus, overhearing what they had said, "Don't be afraid, just believe." And I will end the story there, but if anyone's curious, Jesus did raise Jairus' daughter from the dead, but that is not where we're going to camp out this morning. But in case you're reading ahead and getting distracted, I'll just jump to the end. So I went through a process when reading this story because it came to mind last Sunday just as a story in itself, not with any specific direction. So there is a Bible study technique called the inductive Bible study where you read it a bunch of times essentially, and you observe, you interpret, and you apply, and that is kind of how I came to what I'd be sharing today. So just to share a few observations with you, if you're not familiar with this way to study the Bible, these are the who, what, when, wheres, and whys of the story. And so the who of the story, we have Jairus, the synagogue leader, we have Jesus, the disciples, the crowd, and the bleeding woman. And then the what, so one sentence that I came up with here is Jesus is approached by Jairus to heal his sick daughter, and on his way he meets a suffering woman. And then where this story happens en route to Jairus' home, which is a Roman city. I've rehearsed how to say it many times, but it's drawn a blank on me, so just know it's a Roman city. And I thought it was really interesting as I observed how this healing took place when Jesus was on a mission to heal somebody else. Jesus was not looking for this woman per se. Of course, he is God, so he knew what was going to happen, but he was en route to another place. And another observation that I saw, which is where I'll spend most of the time this morning, is that there are kinds of encounters happening here with Jesus. There is an incidental encounter, and there is an intentional encounter. So there is a crowd of people who are pressing against Jesus at all sides, and then there is one individual woman who, like everyone else, is pressed against him, but she receives a miracle. So I thought it was interesting, the difference there. So to call out the incidental interactions with Jesus, if you didn't catch them, the first time Jesus is pressed on all sides and he's surrounded by a crowd. We see that in verse 24 where he says, where the text says, so Jesus went with him being Jairus, and a large crowd followed him, pressed on every side. And then verse 30 says, he, being Jesus, turned around to the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? And the disciples answered, you see that there is a crowd pressing against you. And then there is the intentional encounter that we see in verse 23, where Jairus pleaded with Jesus to come heal his daughter. So he knew, he had some understanding of who Jesus was and what his abilities were. In verse 28, we see the woman's intentional interaction with Jesus, where she said to herself, so she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And then immediately she was. And then we see in verse 33 a different intentional interaction, which is the woman when Jesus is looking for who touched him. Knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and she told the whole truth. So those are the place I want to hone in this morning, is the intentional interactions between Jesus and this woman. It is important to know as parts of the story that there are onlookers to the story. There are others who will gain something from this interaction, but I just want to hone in just a little bit there. So I'm going to trim down the passage and read it one more time of just these few verses. So we're going from, have been reading Mark 5:21 to 34, and now we're going to start in verse 27. So it says, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch him, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped. She felt in her body that she was freed from suffering. At once, Jesus realized the power had gone out of him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding you, his disciples answered, and yet you ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Yeah, so as we unpack these together, I think it's important to note a few things about the woman. One of those being she's been suffering for 12 years, and that is quite a long time. There are many in this room who are not even 12 years old. So it's a lifetime for some of suffering. But she's been suffering 12 years. She had spent every dollar that she had. So the scripture says earlier, she spent everything she had. She had seen many, many doctors and has not been made well. In fact, she had been made worse. So she was deteriorating over this time. And then what we know of the issue of blood historically is it's likely that she, like the woman at the well, was an outcast of some way. She was marginalized from community. She would be unclean and not allowed to participate in society in the way that a clean person would be able to. So it's important to call those things out because she put herself at a pretty big risk just to touch Jesus' clothes. And so I'm going to go verse by verse, picking up in verse 28, that reads, because she thought if I just touch his clothes, I'd be healed. And to stop there, this woman is entering into the crowd with perhaps desperation. My feeling from reading the story is that this desperation fueled her and really drove her actions, because she'd been suffering for 12 years. She lost all she had. She'd seen every doctor, and she perhaps is approaching Jesus a little bit as I've heard mill term that you have worked miracles, and if that's true, then I want a piece of that miracle. Out of desperation, you perhaps are my last viable option. Could be how she's approaching him of, I'm going to risk what it means to enter into this crowd, to this community, in order to hopefully receive healing. And it's unlikely that she was just part of the crowd, that she was wandering through and happened to see Jesus. Again, she likely, I haven't done a whole lot of research on this, so I can be corrected publicly, that's okay. But she likely, again, was an outcast on the margins, not able to enter into a group setting like this. And so she risked it all through vulnerability and bravery and entered into the crowd so that she could have an encounter with Jesus. And so 28 says, if I touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And verse 29 picks up, immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was free from her suffering. And there are other translations that said she sensed in her body, and for some reason that translates with me a bit better. Perhaps it's the nuance of it, of she sensed and she felt, and maybe, because I think that's how I walk through life often, is maybe this is God, maybe it's not, I'm not really sure. But it does say, the scriptures, that she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. So there is a exchange of power that happens between this woman and Jesus before they even meet each other officially. So she has, again, entered into this story understanding that Jesus has power, and she's entering it in desperation, and this has led to her physical healing, which happened, again, before her and Jesus even spoke. And then the following verse is Jesus' response to her, and he says, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out of him, and he turned around to the crowd and asked, who touched me? And his disciples said, you see the crowd against you. Why are you asking who touched me? Again, I love the disciples. They make me feel better about my own faith journey sometimes, especially that guy Peter. He helps a lot. And so I just appreciated the question that Jesus turned around and asked. And it reminded me of the story of the woman at the well when Jesus says, you're right, you don't have a husband, but you have 5. Jesus uses his responses and his questions as an invitation to an even deeper encounter with him. So at this point, she has received her physical healing, and Jesus is wanting to do more than just heal her from her physical suffering. So does Jesus really not know who touched him? Of course not. He absolutely knows where the power had gone from him, but he uses the question, who touched me, giving the woman an opportunity to speak back to him, and to speak back to him on her terms, which I really appreciated and didn't realize until I was reading the story for about the 100th time this past week. And so he is bringing her into an invitation through the question of who touched me. And then we pick up in verse 33 with the woman saying, knowing what had happened to her, she came and she fell at his feet with trembling and fear and told him the whole truth. The phrase, the whole truth, feels important there. I had a conversation with Chad and Monica this week, and I was just telling them there seems something significant about verbalizing the healing that she has experienced. The whole truth here is not fleshed out in this passage. We don't actually know what her whole truth is, and I don't think we have to know for this story to be as impactful as it is. She could have told him about her medical condition. She could have told him about her past 12 years of not being in community. She could have told him what made her the way that she is, what happened to her. She could have told him how she actually got to him in the crowd. The truth vulnerability and transparency with him. And Jesus responds to that vulnerability. And his response to her is, it's very kind. I'm not surprised that that's Jesus' response. But he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." And that's in verse 34. So to recap what we have just heard in this story, because there's a lot of moving pieces here, there is a crowd around Jesus, many people pressing at him from all sides. If anyone's a Black Friday shopper here, like circa probably 10 years ago when it was a bigger thing before Cyber Monday, you have been in a crowd like that where you're getting pressed on either side. And you never know who's touching you. Perhaps Black Friday shopping doesn't set here, so if you're a sports fan and you've been waiting in line for tickets, or if you've ever been in a concert mosh pit, I don't think that's the vibe here either. But just wanted to throw out a couple of different pictures in your mind for what a crowd being pressed on each side could look like. Jesus was in the middle of this type of crowd when one person out of potentially hundreds touches him in a different way. And then there